Hey everyone, it's Durf, and welcome back to another episode of How to Make Mods for Scrap Mechanic. In the last lesson, we learned how to create custom blocks using the Mod tool, and a little bit about textures in the game. Today we're going to be learning how to create our first custom part. This lesson will cover the basics of creating a 3D model, texturing that 3D model, and all of the JSON code required to use your model in Scrap Mechanic. So without further ado, let's get right into today's lesson. Alright, out here on the desktop, we're going to start by opening up the Mod tool. If you're new to the Mod tool, make sure you check out Lesson 3. It will show you how to install and how to use the Mod tool. So once you've got your Mod tool open, what you're going to want to do is click on New Mod. I'm going to name my mod Part Template. Just like I made one called Block Template for Lesson 3, this one will be called Part Template. Okay, so with our new mod created, we want to click on Open Folder to get started creating our mod. So once we're in our mod folder, we're going to go into Objects, Database, and Shapesets. Whenever you create a new mod with the Mod tool, you always get some extra files generated for you, like these ones here. We don't need to worry about any of these files for today, so you can ignore them for now. In fact, I'm going to delete them just to keep things simple. All we need for today is parts.json. So let's go ahead and open that with a text editing program. We can actually close the mod tool because we don't need to have it running in the background while we're working on this. So I'm just going to go ahead and close it. We'll reopen it when we're ready for it. Okay, so here is what the parts.json file looks like. If you remember from the last lesson, we always start a JSON file with a curly bracket and end it with a curly bracket. In the last lesson, we were working with a block list, but for this lesson, we're going to be working with a part list. So I'm going to go ahead and start by giving us a little bit of room inside these square brackets. So inside our part list, we're going to start by creating our first part, and we do that with a starting curly bracket and an ending curly bracket, just like this. If we wanted to add more parts to this file, all we have to do is add a comma at the end of these curly brackets and start a new set of curly brackets right underneath. But we're only going to be working with one part for now, so we're going to focus on this. So once you've got your curly brackets all set up, we're going to give this part a new property, and that property is going to be called UUID. We're going to give this property a value, and if you remember from the last lesson, we have a friendly little website that will generate a UUID for us. So we just go over to that website, hit refresh just to make sure we're getting a brand new one, and we're going to copy it and paste it as the value for our UUID. And just like that, we have a new unique identifying number for this new part. But this is not the only property that we need. We need more properties so that the game knows what it's doing. So make sure you have a comma at the end of your UUID declaration because we're going to be starting another property underneath, and this property is going to be called renderable. And renderable is it's basically everything that the game is going to try and render onto your screen for your custom part. So this is going to be an object, and we start an object with a curly bracket and an ending curly bracket. Now inside renderable, we're going to have another new property, and it's going to be called LOD list. LOD list is something a little bit complicated to be getting into right now, so I will be covering that in a future lesson. For now, all you have to worry about is just having it in your renderable section. So the LOD list is a list, and like all the other lists that are in our JSON file, a list is just a comma-separated list of stuff, all contained within a set of square brackets. Inside our LOD list, we're going to have another new object. So we're going to start with curly brackets. And inside these curly brackets, we're going to have a property called submeshlist. Submeshlist is another list, so for this one we're going to be using square brackets. And inside the submesh list, we're going to have a list of objects. We can separate them with commas, but we're going to only have one object in it for now, so one set of curly brackets inside the submesh list. And inside this object, inside mesh list, we're going to create a new property, and it's going to be called texture list. And in case you haven't guessed, texture list is yet another list, so we will be using square brackets for this one too. So inside of our texture list, we're going to list the 3 textures, the diff, ASG, and normal map, that our custom part needs to use if we want to actually see it in the game. We don't actually know what these textures are yet because we haven't created them, so for now we're just going to put some placeholders. I'm going to put diff here with a comma, start a new line, ASG here with a comma, and the last item in the texture list is the normal map. Now again, we don't have the textures created yet, so right now I'm just filling in these quotations with diff ASG nor, just to serve as a placeholder until we actually have the textures created. So we are done with texture list for now, but we still have another property to add to the object that's inside submesh list. So when you're done with your texture list, add a comma at the end of that, and then we're going to go underneath on a new line and start a new property, and that property is going to be called material. And the material that we're going to use for today, we're just going to keep things very simple. We're going to put down diff ASG nor, and we're going to capitalize the first letter of each. Diff ASG nor, just like that. We don't need to put a comma at the end of this because it is the last item in the object for the first of the submesh list items. Just outside of the submesh list, but still inside the first object, just outside of the first submesh list, we're going to put a comma there because we're going to define a new property still within the same object. This property is going to be called mesh. And this refers to our 3D model. Again, we haven't really created the 3D model yet, so for now we're just going to put a placeholder. And inside the placeholder, I'm just going to put OBJ because that's the format I will be using for this tutorial. And that's all that we need for the renderable object. So let's get out of the LOD list, back into the renderable section right here. After we're done defining what renderable is, we put a comma at the end of that because we need some more properties. Now this next property you might have seen before, it's called color. And for the color property, we're going to give a default value, EEE, all E's, and that's going to give us a default color that's really close to white. And finally, we need one more property. This last property is going to be called box. And this is like the hitbox for our custom part. So we have defined our textures, our material, our model that we're going to be using, the default color that we want our part to be, and now this is going to be the hitbox information. All of the collision info is going to be stored inside box. So for box, it is an object, so we need some curly brackets. And inside the curly brackets, all we need to define for the box is its dimensions. So if we choose X dimension, we'll say it's 1 wide. The Y dimension, we can say it's 1 wide. And the Z dimension is 1 wide as well. So a 1 by 1 by 1 cube, that's what we're going to be making today. So go ahead and save your parts.json file. We're not finished with the file just yet, so I'm going to leave it open. Right now we're going to take a break from this JSON editing and we're going to go create some textures and a 3D model for our custom part.
2 hours later.
Alright, here we have 3 textures ready to go. We're not going to spend too much time today on how to make these textures because we've already covered creating textures in a previous lesson. But don't worry, there will be more mini tutorials to show you guys some tips and tricks. For now, we'll be using these textures. So as you can see here, we're going to be creating a dice, or a die, just one die. So for our die texture, I'm going to use a 512 by 512 image. But because that's not divisible by 3, We can't have a 3x3 grid of textures on a 512 by 512 image. So the grid I'm using here is 170 by 170 pixels. This lets us have our 3x3 grid inside our image, but this leaves us with an extra 2 pixels along the right side and along the bottom. We will have to keep this in mind when we go to texture our 3D model, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. As you can see, the diff texture is really simple. It is just a transparent image with the dots we'll need for our die, each depicting a face of the die in a different grid square. The ASG was created from the diff texture. The background has a slight shine to it, while the dots are really shiny. Here is the final ASG texture, with reduced opacity so the entire die isn't as reflective. And here is the normal map for the die. I encourage you guys to create these textures yourself. This is good practice for the more complicated stuff we'll be doing later on. But today's lesson is mainly focused on texturing the 3D model, so I have provided a copy of these textures in the description for you guys to work with. So whether you're using the provided textures or have exported your own textures, you're going to want to copy the textures into your mod folder. So with the files ready to copy, let's go into our mod folder, into Objects and Textures, and we put in the textures. My files are called dice_diff.png, dice_asg.png, and dice_nor.png. So now that our dice textures are available into the mod folder, we can update our texture list in our JSON. So here, we want to go to mod data. That's referring to our mod folder. Objects, textures, dicediff.png, because that's the file that I put in there. And we'll just go ahead and copy that for the ASG and the NOR. And just like that, we're going to get working textures in our custom part. I'm just going to go ahead and save the JSON file before I forget. Alright. Once you've got your textures ready to go, we can get started with our 3D model. For our 3D model, I will be using a program called Wings 3D. It is free and easy enough to use for everyone, and it has everything that we'll need to make custom parts in Scrap Mechanic. You should already be familiar with basic geometry and 3D Cartesian planes before diving into a modeling program. So before we get started, I'm going to give you guys a brief tour of Wings 3D, just in case some of you aren't familiar with the program. I'm going to show you the basics of what you need to get started. So at the very top in the middle, you have different selection modes. You can select individual vertices, individual edges, individual faces, or entire objects. At the top right, you have different viewing modes available, like an orthogonal view that you can toggle on and off, or different example lightings that you can toggle on and off. And on the bottom left, there should be an information line. This line will tell you all the information that you need to know every time you want to do something. So right now, it's giving me options like, I can left click to select stuff, I can middle click to start a camera mode, and I can right click to show an actions menu. Anytime you do anything in Wings 3D, this information line will be there to help you. Alright, and the rest should be pretty self-explanatory from there. Anytime you want to do something in Wings, you usually start with a right click. This right click menu has many different options for you to choose from, but keep in mind that the options that appear in this menu depend on which selection mode you're in. Most modeling programs will let you generate some very primitive shapes. And as you can see here in the right-click menu, we have a selection of very simple shapes to choose from. Since we're making a die, we need a cube. But before clicking, we want to make sure we click on this little square on the right side, right here. When you see a square like this in Wings 3D, it means there are additional options that you can choose from. For the cube, we get this little window here with some options. Cuts will let us split our cube into sections, which might be useful for some models later on, but we don't need any cuts for today. The only thing we need to do is change the dimensions of our cube to be a 1x1x1 cube. So we're going to set the width the height, and the depth each to 1, and then click OK. So this is exactly what we need, a 1x1x1 cube. So to start texturing our cube, what you're going to want to do is select the cube, and then right click and go all the way down to UV mapping, and just click on that. After clicking that, we get a new window in Wings 3D called Auto UV Segmenting. This window will let us get specific with how we want our texture applied onto our model. So to prepare our cube, I'm going to select all of the edges. Then I'm going to right click and select Mark Edges for Cut. This will tell Wings that we want to cut up our model so each individual face is by itself. Then we'll take those individual faces and lay them out onto our texture. If we deselect the edges now, we can see in this window that the edges are marked in orange to let us know that those edges are cut edges. With our edges cut and ready to go, we right-click once more and select Continue. This brings up another menu of options that let us decide how we want to start laying out our faces onto the texture. For today's lesson, I'm going to choose Unfolding. After selecting an option, we get a new texturing window that looks like this. Before we get into this, I'm just going to move my mouse over to the main window and then hit my right arrow key a few times to adjust the view. So already we can see the individual faces of our cube laid flat onto this texture. These colored letters that you can see as our texture, this is just an example texture that Wings 3D provides for you for texturing your models. But sometimes this isn't good enough and you want to see your actual texture to know the positions the faces need to be in. So to replace the example texture with your actual texture, you can do that by going to File and Import Image. Then simply browse for your texture image that you want to use and import that. Having a mostly transparent texture in Wings 3D will make things very hard to see. So for this lesson, I will import the normal map texture because that one will be easiest to work with in Wings 3D. After importing the image, go back to the texturing window and right-click, then select Create Texture. This will open a window with some options that will let Wings 3D create a texture based on this image. This process is very useful for certain types of models, but today we only need it for one thing. So in this options window, next to where it says background, click the options button and make sure to set to image. And then click and hold to select your newly imported image in the drop-down menu here. And then click OK. Next you're going to want to click and hold on the Draw Edges drop-down menu and then make sure that is set to none. After all that is done, click OK to reveal your custom texture. So this looks great. We already have 4 of the faces already lined up with our texture. You can already see it right here. But we have 2 problems that we need to solve if we are to continue making this die. The first problem is, when we originally made our textures, it was a 512 by 512 image, and the individual die faces, those were 170 by 170 pixels. This UV mapping window has already split our die faces into 1/3 of the 512 by 512 texture. That's just a little bit too big because we need precisely 170 pixels out of the entire 512. Another problem that we need to take care of is that dice usually have it so that every opposing face adds up to 7. So the number 6 is opposite of the number 1, and the number 2 is opposite of the number 5, and the number 3 is the opposite of number 4. So we need to make sure that we correctly position our faces so that this is the case. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by selecting all of the faces. Right click, choose Scale, and then you see there's these options at the top, but what I want to choose is Max Uniform. And what this is going to do is going to stretch each individual face to be the maximum size of the texture. Just like this. So now if we deselect our faces, we can see that each of the face on our main window has the texture of the complete die. So back into the UV mapping window, we're going to select all of the faces. To make sure that we get the right size for these faces, we have to do a little bit of math. So I'm going to pull out a calculator really quick, and I'm going to do 170 divided by 512, and I get a ratio that looks like this, 0.332033125. And that is actually the percentage that we need to size our faces to be the exact size of 170 pixels on a 512 by 512 texture. So now that we have all of our faces selected and we have the exact ratio that we need to resize it by, we're going to right click and click scale again, and then we're going to click uniformly scale. And this lets us adjust the size to any percentage that we need. But if you notice, down in the bottom left, we can now see if we left click, it will accept our new size. If we right click, it will cancel our new size. But if we hit tab, we can do a numeric entry. So let's hit tab, and then it brings up this menu. So we can actually enter in manually the percentage that we need this size to be. So if we remember our ratio, we needed 33.203125%. And this will be the precise size of a die face. Now that we have the proper size for our faces, we actually need to position them in the correct locations. To do that, we're going to have to do a little bit more math. So, sorry if you don't like math, but that's kind of what we need to do to make sure it's positioned perfectly. I mean, if you wanted to, you can just click and drag or right click and move these faces to any particular arbitrary location that you want, and it should look okay enough for the game. Because, like, remember, this is just going to be a 1x1 block, so it's not going to be too noticeable, but I am going to show you guys how to get it perfectly on the location that you need it. So, if you remember, our texture was 512 by 512. We used 170 by 170 grid, which means that the very center of each face, for example, the very center of the first dice face over here, that's at 85 by 85 pixels. So what we can do is we can take the position of this dice face, which the center of this dice face is 256 by 256, because our entire texture was 512 by 512. So we already know that all of these faces are currently centered at 256 by 256. One thing you might notice when you try to move around these faces, it'll measure the distances in the top left, but it'll measure them out of ratios of 1. So if you go if you go from halfway of the texture to the left side, you can see we made a distance of negative 0.5. That's half a unit to the left. And if we go to the right all the way, that's going to be 0.5 units to the right. So UV mapping likes to do its measurements from 0 to 1. So if we started in the middle, then the top left corner is negative 0.5, 0.5, and the bottom right corner is 0.5, negative 0.5. So what we want to do is find out the ratio between 85 pixels and 512 pixels and subtract that from 0.5. So if we go 85 divided by 512, we get 0.166015,625. And now if we take 0.5 minus 0.166015,625, we get 0.333984375. But this 0.33, this is exactly the distance that we need to move our dice face to be in the proper location. So what we're going to do is we're going to deselect all of our faces, and we're going to select just one face. Which one is it? It's going to be this one over here. Okay, so for this face here, we're going to right click. We're going to select move, and then we're going to move it freely. This means we're going to move the face both horizontally and vertically at the same time. So when we click free, we just start dragging it to the top left here. And just by trying to position it into the right place, we can already see that our distances are supposed to be negative 0.33. So let's hit tab to make sure we get a numerical entry, and we can enter in our exact ratio, which was 0.333984375. 333 984375. And we do the same for both. 333 984, and it doesn't seem like Wings is really going to care about the rest of the digits, so we'll just leave it at that. And click OK. And that's how you get the perfect alignment for your face, depending on what your pixels were and what grid size you chose. And this is all like very dependent on what your 3D model is, so don't worry, we'll be doing more examples like this, and not all of the examples that we're going to be doing requires math, but this one does, just because we need to line up the faces perfectly so our dice doesn't look sort of wonky in game. So now we're going to do the rest of the faces, and we're going to do them in increments of our new ratio here. So if we select another face, which one is this? Perfect. It's the opposite face of our number 1. So if you remember from our little bit of trivia, this has to be dice face number 6. It's not quite such an easy ratio to do, so we're going to just right click and we're going to move it into the same spot as we did our first dice face, just to get a good starting point. So let's move it close enough and then fill in the blanks just by putting 333 984, just like that. 333 984. And then we click OK. Now that we have our face lined up with the first dice face, what we want is the ratio of 170 pixels to 512. We already got that before, I think. So if we do 170 divided by 512, yeah, we get that same ratio, 0.33203.125. So this is the amount that we have to move our faces by to displace it by 170 pixels in the directions that we need. So to get the number 6 face to the number 6 image, we actually need to move it vertically down by 0.33203.125 and over to the right 0.33203.125 times 2. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Right click, move. We'll do free. And so down, we move it by approximately 0.33. And then to the right by 0.33 times 2. So let's hit tab to get an exact entry. Here we go. Our vertical displacement needs to be 0.33203.125. And our horizontal displacement needs to be twice that amount, so it is 0.6640625. And just like that, we have a perfectly aligned dice face. Now, here is where you can start to see the difference. If I were to deselect this, and I were to zoom in really close, you can already see how the alignment is different. Like these dice faces that are supposed to be in the center, our dice texture is not perfectly in the center. So we need to get our UV mapping precise, and this is how we do it. So doing the rest of the dice faces is a very similar process. You just take the dice face that you're working on, you stick it on over to the first dice face location just to make sure the dice face is lined up with the grid that we used on our texture, like the 170 by 170 grid. And then we move that dice face into increments of 170 pixels across the texture. It does take a little bit of math to convert what 170 pixels means to a UV map, but it's very simple to do once you understand how to do it. So we're just going to quickly go through the rest of the faces. Okay, and just like that, we have all of our dice faces lined up perfectly with their texture. And as you can see, our 512 by 512 texture has a spare 2 pixels on the side. This is exactly what our 170 by 170 grid did with our texture, so this is exactly what our UV map needs to be perfect. So now that we have all of our faces lined up perfectly on our model, we can close this window. And now what we want to do is we want to go File, down to Export, and then we want to go down to Wavefront. That's the .obj that we see here. But before clicking on this, we want to make sure we click on the little square on the right side here to make sure we get all the options that we need. Here is the Wavefront export options. You don't really need to worry too much about these options. You can just make sure that your window looks like mine. The important part is that you want to export normals and smoothing groups and export UV coordinates. All that work that we did with our texturing, this is the option that exports that information along with our model. So after you've made sure all your options are good, just click OK. When you click OK, you're going to get an export window. Just make sure you set a file name to something that makes sense. I'm going to name mine dice.obj, and I'm going to export it straight onto my desktop. Okay, now might also be a good time if you want to go to File and Save, Regular Save. What we're going to do is save a Wings file. This will let us come back to Wings 3D in case we want to make any changes to our model later on. So go ahead and save your Wings file. I'm going to name mine the same thing. It's just going to be dice.wings. I'm just going to put them on my desktop. So we're done with Wings 3D for now. So let's just go ahead and minimize it for now. Now on our desktop, you might have noticed that Wings 3D exported 3 files. We have this PNG image that was the texture that we created. We have this material file. We don't need these 2 files, so you can just go ahead and delete them. Dice.obj. This is what we need for our Scrap Mechanic custom part. So we're going to go ahead back into our mod folder here. We're going to go into Objects, Mesh. And we're just going to stick this dice.obj into the mesh folder. Now that we have our .obj in our mod folder, we can update our JSON and finally finish our custom part. Put mod data in the mesh section here, /objects /mesh. Make sure you spell the folder names correctly with the capital letters. And dice.obj. And there you go. That is everything that you need to know to make a custom part in Scrap Mechanic. So let's go ahead and save this parts.json. Now let's go back into the game to see how our custom part turned out. Alright, so back into the game. Let's go ahead and see how our new part looks. Of course, we don't have an icon or item description for it yet, but hey, looks like it turned out pretty good. So let's take it out and let's see how it looks. Put a block of wood down, or 2 first. There we go. Yeah, it looks all right. There's this weird lighting thing that's happening to it. So I guess it's time to show you guys how to fix that. If you have this happen to some of your models and it looks gross, I'll show you guys how to fix it. Aw, come on, I was hoping for a number. Darn it. So our new custom part, it looks alright, but we want to fix this lighting issue, so let's show you guys a trick in Wings 3D that we can do to fix this lighting issue. We want this to be like flat. So let's get out of the game and see what we can do to fix that. Okay, so back out onto the desktop. What we're going to do to fix that model, we're actually going to open up our Wings 3D file again because we need to edit our 3D model. But it's a very simple fix to do. As a matter of fact, here, let's show you really quick. If we select this option right here to see some example lighting, we can see the same sort of lighting effect happening in Wings 3D. It doesn't really look too good, and why is the top face like half of it is light, half of it is dark? That doesn't make sense. So what we're going to do is we're going to select all of the edges, we're going to right click, we're going to go down to hardness, and we're going to select hard edges. You can already see the lighting changed immediately. What hard edges does, it changes how sharp a corner is. So if you imagine like an edge that's like a little bit rounded, the light will sort of bend around it a little bit, so the lighting will look very different. And if you select very hard edges, light is only going to hit one face of it at a time. So that's what we have here with these example lighting. It already looks much better. And when we deselect the example lighting button, we can see that our edges are now orange, and they represent hard edges in Wings 3D. If we select one of these edges, go to hardness, soft, and then deselect it, you'll see that it's black again because it's a soft edge. But if we go into example lighting, this is a good example to show you guys. The two faces over there, they will sort of act like one face, at least when it comes to lighting it. So if you can see the lighting, it's very smooth around that corner, but all the other edges, it's very, very abrupt. The change in lighting, it's very quick, so that's what hard edges do, and that's going to come in very handy later on for other models. So we'll just go back to hardness, set all of the edges to hard, because this is a perfect cube. We don't really need soft edges on our dice. So now that we have all of our edges hard, we're going to go ahead and just click this save button right here to save our wings file, and then we're also going to go down to export and export our object. Just going to click OK. We're going to export it straight to the desktop again. Now we are done with Wings 3D, so we can go ahead and close that. Now on the desktop here, you see there's the three files that were exported again. We don't need the PNG or the material file, so we can go ahead and delete those two items. And the dice.object, we're going to go ahead and replace the one that we have in our mod already. So we just move it there and click replace. So now we have our updated model. Let's go ahead in the game to see how our updated model looks. Alright, here we are back into the game. Let's check to see how our dice are doing. Oh, and they look much better already. Look at that. They look like they're just flush with each other now. So let's go ahead and remove one. And give it a roll. Yeah. Wow, that was crazy. But we're not done our custom part just yet because we don't have an icon or an inventory description. See, when we hover over the icon, it just has this mess with the UUID that we chose, and it tells us our collision is a box that is 1 by 1 by 1 at least. So we need to update the inventory description and give this part an icon. So let's get out of the game and finish up our new custom part. Okay, out here on the desktop, we're going to go out of the objects folder, and we're going to go into the GUI, the GUI folder, and into language, into English, and inventory descriptions.json. This is the file that we need to edit. So we're going to go ahead and just drag that into our text editing program right here. We don't need any of this stuff. If you remember from the last lesson, we just start this with a curly bracket and end it with a curly bracket. Then what we want to do is we want to start a new property in this file, and this property is going to be the UUID for our object. So we're going to copy the UUID for our dice, and we're going to paste it here, and we're going to say for this UUID we want two things. We want a title, and we want a description. So for the title, we're going to put dice. I guess we should put die. So for the title, we're going to put die, and for the description, we're going to put so that's what I'm going to be putting down for my description. You can use whatever you want. You don't even have to have a description if you don't want one. This file is really simple to fill out, so once you've got this filled out, just go ahead and click save, and then we're done. Just close all of this. We don't need our text editing program anymore. But what we do need to do is get a new icon in. So we're going to go back into our Scrap Mechanic mod tool. Here it is. I'm going to go to our part template. That's what we've been working on. And already you can see it detects a new part. So let's go ahead and click Create Icons. And the icon generator will be doing its thing. Oh, it's done already. So let's go back into our mod folder, into the GUI folder. And here we see the icon map files have been generated. Let's take a quick peek to see how our icon looks. Nice. Nice. We got a dice ready to go in game. So all that's left to do is to give your mod a proper description, a nice little preview, and then you can go ahead and upload your mod to the workshop. So now all that's left to do is to test your mod in-game just one last time to make sure everything looks okay. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. Alright, here we are back into the game. And already we can see that we have a new icon in our hotbar. Let's check our inventory just to make sure. Yep, we've got an icon and a nice description that says die. This part has a 1/6 chance of being awesome. Alright, I think everything looks good, so I think we're done here. Now, if you remember from our last lesson, we had some extra properties that we added in afterwards. So let's go back into our parts, into our objects, into our database, into our shapes. It's into our parts.json file. And in here, what we're going to do is we're going to set a new property for our object. Underneath color, we're just going to go and set the density. And we're adding this in to say how heavy we want our dice to be. I think a good density setting for a die in Scrap Mechanic would be the same weight as metal, heavyweight. And that's just to make sure that when somebody hits the die with a hammer, it doesn't go flying too far. So we're going to set 1250 for the density. And we're just going to go ahead and click save. And that's going to be our final die, our final dice in Scrap Mechanic. So we're going to go ahead and close that. So now all that's left to do is to go back into your main mod folder here and just update the preview.jpg with something that shows the world what your mod is all about. Don't forget to give your mod a meaningful description in the mod tool, and then when you're ready to upload it, just click Upload Mod. And that's it. That's the basics of what you need to know to create a custom part in Scrap Mechanic. So that concludes our lesson for today. If you liked the video, don't forget to drop a like. It really helps the video and my channel. I hope you guys learned something new, and I hope you have an easier time when going to create your own custom parts for Scrap Mechanic. Don't worry if this was a little confusing at first. It's a lot to take in all at once, so be sure to practice, practice, practice. If you have any questions about the stuff that we covered in this lesson, leave a comment down below with your questions, and I will answer them as soon as I can. This is just an introduction into custom parts for Scrap Mechanic, and the first of a 3-part lesson. So there will be 2 other videos coming out very soon to help teach you guys more about custom parts. Tutorial videos like this one are only made possible by my very lovely supporters on Patreon. I wouldn't have the time to make videos like this if it wasn't for their support, so a huge shout out to my patrons. If you'd like to help support the production of more tutorials like this one, or maybe you just want to get a sneak peek on the next mod that I'm working on, head on over to patreon.com/Durf for more information. And if you never want to miss out on another Scrap Mechanic mod or tutorial, be sure to visit youtube.com/Durf and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in another video. Bye-bye!